Hitler committed suicide in the Berlin bunker in 1945. He packed his personal documents into tin trunks and tried to have them flown out to Bavaria. The aircraft was shot down over what is now East Germany.
People have been guessing for years about how Adolf Hitler really died. Some said he ran away and lived in hiding. Others thought he faked his death. But now, new facts have come out, and the truth isn't easy to hear.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced.
It turns out he didn't escape at all. What really happened is much more sad and scary than the rumors. And now that we know, it changes how we think about the end of his story. Is Hitler still alive? An unusual silence. It's strange how quietly some of history's loudest figures disappear. Adolf Hitler, whose speeches once shook nations and whose war tore through continents, spent his last days not on a battlefield or in front of a courtroom, but deep underground, in a dim, concrete bunker beneath the wreckage of Berlin. There, behind steel doors and thick walls, the man who had once demanded total control over a continent was reduced to something far more human, isolated, aged beyond his years, and surrounded only by a shrinking circle of loyal aides. It was April 1945. The war was lost, the city was falling, and the sound of approaching Soviet artillery echoed overhead like a ticking clock. Inside that bunker, time was running out. A wedding, a farewell, and a vanishing act. Just days before the end, something unexpected happened. Hitler married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a quiet civil ceremony held in the early hours of April 29th. There were no crowds, no flowers, and no music. Only a handful of witnesses and a sense of finality. The next day, April 30th, the two were gone. According to those present, Hitler and Eva retreated into a private room. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. Some accounts say she swallowed cyanide, while he turned a pistol on himself. Others recall slightly different details, but everyone agrees on one thing. Their bodies were found lifeless, side by side. Hitler had reportedly ordered his aides to burn the bodies immediately in the garden behind the chancellery. And so, in the middle of a ruined city and a collapsing regime, a hurried cremation took place under fire. The remains were buried in a shallow crater. When Soviet soldiers arrived hours later, they found scorched fragments and little else. What remained was doubt. The Soviet Union claimed they had recovered Hitler's body, but they never showed the world definitive proof. In fact, they later changed their own story multiple times. Stalin, unusually guarded on the subject, even told Western leaders that he believed Hitler had escaped. It wasn't long before the rumors began. No body, no public photos, just eyewitness testimony from the people who had every reason to protect Hitler's legacy, or to rewrite it. The seeds of doubt were planted not by conspiracy theorists, but by the silence and secrecy that followed the war's end. What started as a straightforward story, self-harm in a bunker, soon became something more complicated. It wasn't just the absence of a body. It was the way the truth seemed to shift depending on who was telling it. The family left behind. While the world's attention focused on the man, few thought to ask about the people who shared his name. Hitler didn't have children of his own, at least not publicly acknowledged ones, but he did have relatives, some of whom lived long after the war, carrying the weight of that name in ways most of us can't imagine. One of the most well-known was William Patrick Hitler, a nephew born in England to Hitler's half-brother, Alois Jr. William actually visited Germany in the 30s, hoping his famous uncle could help him secure a good job. But things soured quickly between them. When war broke out, William moved to the United States, joined the U.S. Navy, and fought in the very war that would end his uncle's rule. After the war, he settled in New York under a different name, raising a quiet family and avoiding attention for the rest of his life. Then there were others, less known, more private, who scattered across Europe and North America, distancing themselves from the past. Some reportedly changed their names, disappeared from public records, or quietly vowed never to have children, hoping to end the family line entirely. There's a kind of haunting in history, not from ghosts, but from the quiet stories that never make the headlines. The last days of Hitler's life are full of such stories, of loyalty, fear, silence, and survival, of a family trying to disappear into the fabric of ordinary life, of a world left wondering what really happened when the doors of that bunker closed for the last time. Whether Hitler truly died that day in 1945 or something else happened, one thing is clear. The way his story ended or didn't has shaped decades of uncertainty. And it all began with a quiet moment in an underground room, just before the world changed forever. The theory that wouldn't die. In history, a clean ending helps people move on. A clear villain, a final act, a closed chapter. But when pieces are missing, or when too many questions go unanswered, stories tend to keep growing. That's exactly what happened with Hitler's death. While textbooks printed the self-harm story, a parallel tale was quietly gaining strength. That Hitler didn't die in that bunker, he escaped. To many, it sounded far-fetched, but to others, it made a strange kind of sense. The man who once controlled one of the most efficient wartime networks in the world, who had planned invasions down to the minute, was suddenly gone. And all we had were witness testimonies and a few burnt remains no one could reliably verify. It didn't help that the Soviet Union, which claimed to have Hitler's body, refused to share clear proof with the West. As the Cold War heated up, so did the rumors. The most popular theory? That Hitler had fled to Argentina. Argentina had long been friendly to Axis powers. President Juan Perón welcomed many former Nazis with open arms after the war. Men like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele found refuge in the country, living comfortably under false identities until they were eventually discovered. So when stories surfaced of a mysterious German community nestled in the Patagonian mountains, a quiet area full of chalets, alpine names, and blonde-haired residents, people began to talk. Could Hitler have been among them? Several witnesses later claimed to have seen a man matching Hitler's description in the region during the 40s and 50s. Some described a reclusive older man with a trimmed mustache, often accompanied by German-speaking guards. Others swore he was living under the name Adolf Leipzig and had grown old in peace. The most detailed version came from the book Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler, by British authors Simon Dunstan and Gerard Williams. They suggested Hitler had lived in Argentina until the 60s, and even fathered children with Eva Braun. Their theory was based on declassified intelligence documents, witness interviews, and travel records that seemed, at the very least, suspicious. Ratlines, a real pathway. One reason this theory gained traction is because Nazi escape routes, often called ratlines, really did exist. After the fall of Berlin, dozens of high-ranking Nazi officials vanished. Many of them resurfaced in South America, using fake passports, new identities, and forged Red Cross papers. Much of this underground network passed through Catholic churches in Austria and Italy. Some of the most notorious war criminals were aided, directly or indirectly, by sympathetic clergy and former SS contacts. The network was extensive, fast-moving, and shockingly well-organized. If so many others had escaped, why not Hitler? One of the most infamous groups, known as Odessa, short for Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, allegedly specialized in helping former SS officers find new lives abroad. While historians still debate how centralized or real Odessa was, the results were clear. Hundreds of Nazis escaped justice for decades. While Argentina might seem like a plausible destination, Antarctica sits on the wilder side of the escape narrative. But even this version has some real historical roots. During the late 30s, Nazi Germany launched expeditions to a portion of Antarctica they called Neuschwabenland. The official purpose was whaling and exploration, but some later speculated that Germany was interested in building a remote military base, or worse, a hidden refuge should the war go badly. Decades later, stories emerged suggesting the Nazis had constructed underground facilities in Antarctica. Some even claimed Hitler escaped there by submarine and lived in a secret fortress beneath the ice. These tales grew even more curious when paired with Operation High Jump, a large-scale U.S. Navy mission to Antarctica in 1946. Though publicly framed as a scientific expedition, the operation involved over 4,000 troops, battleships, and aircraft. Some speculated it was actually a search-and-destroy mission against a surviving Nazi base. The U.S. government, of course, never said anything to support that claim. A skull, a tooth, and a decades-old mystery. For decades, it was assumed that the Soviet Union had at least some of Hitler's remains locked away. A bit of skull, some teeth, maybe fragments of bone. These relics were never shown publicly in full, but over the years, bits of the story trickled out. The Soviets had apparently retrieved a scorched jawbone and part of a skull from the garden outside the bunker. Pieces they claimed proved Hitler had died exactly as the official version described. But there was a problem. No one else was allowed to verify it. For over 60 years, the world simply had to take the Soviet Union's word for it. No independent lab tested the remains, and no photos were released until decades later. In 2000, the Russians put the supposed skull fragment on display for the first time. It was a small piece with a bullet hole. They said it had been found in Berlin, right where Hitler died. Then, in 2009, the story changed again. That year, an American team led by Connecticut archaeologist and bone specialist Nick Bellantoni was granted permission to examine the skull fragment held by the Russians. With careful DNA testing, they made a stunning discovery. The skull didn't belong to Hitler at all. It belonged to a woman, likely under 40 years old. The implications were huge. If this was the same piece the Soviets had claimed for decades was proof of Hitler's death, then the official record had a major gap. Whose skull was it? Was it actually from the bunker? Was it Eva Braun's? Or someone else entirely? The Russians insisted their evidence was still valid, especially the jaw fragment, which hadn't been tested by the American team. That jaw, they said, had been matched to Hitler's dental records long ago by Soviet doctors. But once again, the world had to take someone else's word for it. Another complication is how quickly Hitler's body was burned. The fire was carried out under extreme conditions. Shelling above, chaos all around, and limited fuel. According to Gunsha, Hitler's adjutant, several cans of petrol were used to incinerate the bodies. But experts argue that it would be nearly impossible to completely destroy two bodies in a garden fire with that amount of fuel. What this means is that either the bodies were not fully destroyed, and remains should have been easily recoverable, or they weren't there long enough to burn thoroughly, raising the question, were they even the real bodies? The inconsistency doesn't prove anything, but it adds to a growing sense of confusion. If the evidence was that strong, why so many conflicting details? The body double theory. Another layer to this mystery is the long-standing claim that Hitler had one or more body doubles, men who resembled him closely and could be used for decoys during public appearances or dangerous situations. It's a tactic many world leaders have allegedly used. Saddam Hussein reportedly had doubles. So did Joseph Stalin. Could Hitler have prepared one for a final deception? Some who question the official story point to hurried witness testimonies taken in the chaotic days after Berlin's fall. One guard claimed the body looked slightly different than the Hitler he had known. Another described Eva Braun's corpse, but noted inconsistencies in clothing and hair. Of course, in a moment of panic, memory is unreliable. Still, these comments have fed the idea that someone else might have died in Hitler's place, leaving the real man to slip away. There is one piece of evidence that has held up more strongly: Hitler's dental remains. The jawbone and dental bridges stored in Russian archives were reportedly examined in 1945 and again in later years. In both cases, they were matched to Hitler's known dental records and verified by people who had worked directly with his dental team. In 2017, a French team was allowed to conduct a new study of the jawbone. Their conclusion? The teeth matched historical records and likely belonged to Hitler. They found no signs of meat consumption. Hitler was a vegetarian. And the condition of the teeth supported long-term use of poor-quality bridges, something noted in past medical reports. Still, critics point out that this study, like the others, relied on evidence held exclusively by Russia. The chain of custody, verification methods, and opportunity for independent review remain extremely limited. Modern forensic technology could settle many of these questions for good. DNA sequencing, facial reconstruction, isotope analysis, and AI comparison tools have the potential to either confirm the historical account or expose major gaps. But there's a catch. Much of the key material is still locked away. Russia controls what little remains there are. Access is rare. Requests are slow. And after so many decades, the trail of hard evidence has grown cold. For now, the story remains in a strange place, caught between history and uncertainty. Science may hold the answers, but it can't do much without cooperation. The modern angle. For decades, government archives around the world held thousands of files related to Nazi Germany, World War II, and the aftermath of the Third Reich. Most were classified, sealed away under layers of security, until recent years. Thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, many of these documents have now been released, and they've added even more twists to the already tangled story. Among them are hundreds of pages of FBI and CIA reports, some as late as the 50s, that mention sightings of Adolf Hitler in Argentina, Brazil, and other parts of South America. These aren't conclusive reports. Most read like tips or second-hand stories passed to agents in the post-war years. Many were never seriously investigated. But the fact that U.S. intelligence even entertained the idea, collecting and filing reports for years after 1945, raises eyebrows. Were they simply covering all possibilities? Or was there something in those tips that kept the file drawers from closing? In today's world, mystery rarely stays untouched by technology. And in the case of Hitler's death, modern tools have started asking old questions in new ways. Facial recognition AI has been used unofficially to compare known photographs of Hitler with images of unidentified men living in South America post-War II. While none of the results are conclusive, some comparisons have shown possible facial matches, enough to fuel online theories and curiosity. Then there's genetic genealogy, the same science that solved decades-old cold cases. In theory, it could be used to compare DNA from Hitler's living relatives with the remains stored in Russian archives. But access remains the biggest obstacle. The Russians hold the bone fragments and jaw allegedly belonging to Hitler. But they've only allowed a limited number of studies, most of them on their terms. No modern DNA comparison has ever been made public. And unless that changes, the debate will continue to circle without resolution. Meanwhile, amateur researchers, historians, and digital sleuths are keeping the hunt alive. Declassified files are being combed through by AI, old film reels are being digitized and enhanced, and new eyewitness accounts, some previously dismissed, are being re-evaluated with fresh tools. Websites and archives have emerged that host thousands of pages of post-war intelligence data. Some researchers have tracked flight records, submarine movements, and international border crossings, trying to piece together the possibility of escape. The biggest question at the heart of all this isn't just what happened, it's what if? What if Hitler didn't die in that bunker? What if he escaped and lived for decades under a false name? The implications would reach far beyond the pages of history books. What if Hitler lived? For one, it would mean justice was never truly served. The world moved on, rebuilt, and healed under the belief that the man responsible for World War II was gone. If that belief turned out to be false, it would reshape how we view accountability and post-war justice. It could also call into question other events of the era. Were intelligence agencies complicit? Did governments choose silence over scandal? Did secrecy win over truth? Perhaps most unsettling is the idea that a figure like Hitler could simply disappear, and that the world, with all its power and technology, might not notice. There's a reason this story remains open in the minds of so many. It's not just about what happened in 1945. It's about how we deal with endings we can't fully see. When there's no body, no trial, and no definitive evidence, history becomes a little less stable. And when that history involves someone like Adolf Hitler, the consequences of uncertainty ripple for generations. Still, we're left with more clarity than not. The vast majority of evidence supports the theory that Hitler died in the bunker, just as his inner circle described. Yet even now, the gaps invite questions, and the whispers haven't fully faded. The death that refuses to die. Adolf Hitler is one of history's darkest figures. His legacy of violence, ideology, and devastation still echoes through politics, education, and the very way we think about leadership and morality. It's no surprise, then, that his death would become a question mark the world couldn't quite put down. In the official record, the case is closed. Hitler died by self-harm in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. Witnesses saw it. His closest aides confirmed it. Forensic studies, particularly of his dental remains, have supported it. Historians, for the most part, have moved on, but the idea that he may have escaped has refused to fade. And that persistence says more about us than it does about him. Maybe it's the secrecy with which the Soviet Union handled his remains. Maybe it's the scattered tips and documents that hinted at other possibilities. Maybe it's our deep discomfort with the thought that someone responsible for so much pain might have chosen the timing and manner of his own end. Or maybe it's just human nature, our endless curiosity, our love of a good mystery, and our instinct to question what we're told when the facts feel incomplete. Whatever the reason, Hitler's death has become more than a historical event. It has become a lens through which we view truth, authority, and the long shadows of war. There is something unresolved about how Hitler's story ends. Unlike other wartime leaders, he wasn't tried. He wasn't captured. He wasn't paraded before the public or placed in a courtroom like many of his top generals. His story, unlike theirs, ended behind closed doors with only a few people present and very little physical evidence left behind. That absence of finality opened the door for alternative stories, some careful and well-researched, others speculative and wild. And while most of them lead nowhere, they still speak to a broader truth. People struggle with the idea of evil slipping away in silence. We want consequences. We want clarity. We want to know, without doubt, that those who bring harm are held accountable. And when that certainty is missing, even for a moment, the doubt spreads like a shadow over the whole story. What's remarkable is that nearly 80 years later, people still care. Not because they want to glorify the past, but because they want to understand it. They want to know how power ends, how regimes collapse, how someone who seemed to control everything could disappear so completely, or so confusingly. In the end, Hitler's death may not be about escape at all. It might be about what we need from history in order to make peace with it. Closure, yes, but also transparency, truth, and the courage to face even the darkest parts of the past without rewriting them to feel more comfortable. Whether or not every piece of the puzzle will ever be found, the bigger picture is clear. Hitler's story ended in failure, surrounded by ruins, in a bunker beneath a fallen city. Understanding the paradox. History is filled with complicated figures, but few are as divisive and enigmatic as Adolf Hitler. As the dictator who led Nazi Germany into one of the darkest periods in modern history, it's shocking to consider that Hitler wasn't just feared. He was also adored by millions during his rise and reign. Even more surprising is the affection extended to members of his inner circle and family. How could someone responsible for so much destruction also inspire admiration and loyalty? To understand this paradox, we must take a deep dive into the historical, social, and psychological factors that shaped public perception of Hitler and those close to him. First, it's important to acknowledge the role of timing and context. Hitler rose to power in the early 30s, when Germany was in a state of deep economic despair and national humiliation following World War I. The Treaty of Versailles had devastated the German economy, stripping the country of territory, pride, and resources. Inflation was out of control, unemployment was rampant, and many Germans felt like they were being punished by the rest of the world. Into this storm of discontent stepped Hitler, a charismatic speaker who promised to restore Germany's greatness, provide jobs, and give people a sense of purpose again. For many Germans, Hitler wasn't initially seen as a tyrant, but as a savior. He talked about strength, unity, and national pride. To a public desperate for change, this message was extremely appealing. People wanted hope, and Hitler provided it. Wrapped in fiery speeches, nationalist rhetoric, and carefully choreographed public events. He didn't come across as a monster. Rather, he presented himself as a man of the people, someone who understood their suffering and had a plan to fix it. His ability to tap into these emotions is a major reason he was loved, despite what would eventually become undeniable atrocities. Propaganda also played a massive role. Under the guidance of Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Germany's Minister of Propaganda, the regime created a near-constant stream of positive imagery around Hitler. Films, posters, speeches, and even school curricula painted him as a heroic figure, brave, disciplined, self-sacrificing, and morally upright. He was often shown as a kind-hearted animal lover, a man who lived modestly, abstained from alcohol, and genuinely cared about the well-being of the German people. The media was tightly controlled, and dissenting voices were silenced. As a result, the public saw only what the regime wanted them to see. To many ordinary Germans, Hitler appeared not only competent, but genuinely good. It wasn't just propaganda, though. It was also results. In the early years of his rule, Hitler did succeed in pulling Germany out of economic depression. Massive public works projects, like the construction of the Autobahn, reduced unemployment, the economy stabilized, national pride returned, and Germans began to feel hopeful for the future. For many, this was proof that Hitler was delivering on his promises. As people's lives improved, their loyalty deepened. They were willing to overlook or even ignore the darker elements of Nazi policy, particularly those aimed at Jewish citizens and other minorities. Then there's the social psychology angle. Humans are tribal by nature. We tend to rally around strong leaders, especially in times of fear or uncertainty. Hitler created a strong in-group mentality, one that emphasized us, true Germans, versus them, Jews, communists, foreigners, etc. This kind of thinking fosters loyalty and makes people feel as if they're part of something bigger than themselves. When you're part of the favored group, it's easy to ignore what's happening to those outside of it. Many Germans didn't personally witness the horrors of concentration camps or the full extent of the Holocaust until much later. By that time, they were already emotionally and ideologically invested. What about Hitler's family and close associates? Figures like Eva Braun, his longtime companion and brief wife, his half-brother Alois, and others in his personal circle often enjoyed public curiosity or even admiration. In part, this was a result of the aura Hitler created around himself. His personal life was shrouded in mystery, which made people even more interested in those who were close to him. Eva Braun, for example, was portrayed as a loyal, quiet partner who stayed by his side until the very end. She was romanticized in a way that removed her from the political and moral chaos of the regime. Moreover, Hitler's family and associates were often shielded from criticism by their relative distance from actual policymaking. Many Germans didn't see them as active participants in the atrocities, even if they benefited from them. Some, like Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, even managed to recast themselves in a more sympathetic light after the war. Speer, in particular, presented himself as the good Nazi who didn't know the full extent of the Holocaust. This narrative allowed certain individuals within Hitler's orbit to maintain a level of public sympathy, even after the regime's crimes came to light. It's also worth mentioning the power of myth and nostalgia. After the fall of Nazi Germany, some segments of the population, particularly those who felt betrayed by the outcome of the war or disillusioned by the post-war world, clung to a nostalgic vision of the past. In this version of events, Hitler was remembered not for his genocide, but for his ability to unify the country, stand up to foreign powers, and instill national pride. This revisionist thinking contributed to the lingering affection some held for him and his regime. Of course, none of this excuses or justifies the actions of Hitler or his associates. The love and admiration he received from many people at the time were based on manipulation, deception, and deeply rooted social and psychological mechanisms. But understanding how and why people could support such a leader helps us learn from the past. It reminds us that dangerous leaders don't always rise through force alone. They often come to power by speaking to the hopes and fears of ordinary people. So, did Hitler really die in 1945? All signs point to yes, but the story we tell about it, how we explain it, how we pass it on, and how we fill in its blanks, will always reflect our own relationship with history itself. In that sense, the mystery of his death is also a mirror. It shows us what we fear, what we question, and what we refuse to let go. Maybe that's the real reason this story has lasted so long. Not because of what it says about him, but because of what it says about us. Subscribe to the channel for more.